So today I get to talk to you again. And this time we're talking about environmental health. So I'll start with a really open-ended question, which is, what is the environment? Anyone want to hazard an opinion? How do we define environment, do you think? How could we define it?
Environment could be possibly defined as how people live, the lifestyles that people live, how they interact with one another.
The lifestyle that people live and how they interact with one another. Okay. What else?
I would say the area around you, just your locale, whatever's around you, whether it be your exact living location, town, county, whatever.
So your geographic location, sure. What else?
I guess you could think about the social environment, so the people around you.
Yep, getting back to what Afra was saying, the interactions you have with other people around you, sure.
I would say your home and housing quality as well.
Your home and your housing quality? Anything else? How about if we bring in another word, environmental health? What do you guys think of when you hear the term environmental health?
Sorry, is it okay?
Go ahead, yeah.
The exposure, like what you are exposed to where you live, work, and play.
What you are exposed to where you live, work, and play.
And how that affects your health.
And how it affects your health. How does that sound? Any other thoughts on that? What do you think of when you hear environmental health?
I think of I don't know how to say this, how well the earth is doing, like the well-being of the planet, nature.
Okay, so something about perhaps ecology.
Yes.
So the complex web of interactions between living and non-living things. Yes, sure. Any other thoughts on environmental health? Is that a useful term or is it too broad to be practical? Would you want to restrict the definition in any way to make it more specific?
I think it's helpful to think of physical environment, social environment, natural environment. So to add that modifier to it. So I know.
Break it down, right? Absolutely. Go ahead.
Maybe looking at specific populations like pediatrics or a certain type of worker.
So we can also break it down by populations. Who's being affected in this case? Yes. So, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a huge, huge field. I'm going to focus it down a little bit in some of the ways you folks suggested. So we are going to focus more on children. And I'll give an argument for why they're probably the most important population. I'm biased coming from the pediatric point of view. And also in terms of perhaps using categories like the social environment versus the physical environment. Protecting children from toxicants. So toxicants, I should give a quick note, is a very broad term. So when we talk about the environment, I'll use the word toxicants to refer to the particular components of the environment that can actually cause the harm in an individual. You'll probably see in the media, news reports, consumer products, the messaging around those things, the word toxin, T-O-X-I-N, used in a very loose and perhaps even improper way, in that a toxin is a very specific subset of toxicants. So does anyone know what a literal toxin is, or an example of a literal toxin?
arsenic.
So why do you say arsenic? Just as a guess, because like, I don't know, arsenic, let's try arsenic.
Because I don't, it's poisonous. and-
It's okay. So any of these toxicants, we might also call them poisons in some way. It's kind of synonymous, saying that this is an agent that can cause harm to the human body. Toxin specifically refers to chemical agents produced by biological organisms. So let's say that a person's worried about the wrinkles in their face and they go to the dermatologist. What does the dermatologist do to fix the wrinkles? Botox, which is short for botulinum toxin. So Clostridium botulinum is a bacterium that produces this substance that happens to be neurotoxic. It kills nerve cells. So that sometimes helps get rid of wrinkles because you're not pulling on the musculature under the skin as much. So that's a toxin. Or we talk about like staph endotoxin, or, or if you're bitten by a snake. So it's mentioning things that are poisonous versus venomous, actually. Things that bite you are venomous. Things that you bite, those are poisonous. So if a snake bites you, that's venomous, but the venom contains toxins, neurotoxins and such, that are adverse to your health. So that's a minor point, but toxicant is the word we use for the broad category that would include things like arsenic and even forms of energy, noise pollution, socially mediated toxicants. We'll get into that. Just curious, and I'll raise my hand too for this question. Has anyone ever tried a dietary cleanse or detox, or know somebody who has done that? I can't see the whole Brady Bunch array of faces, but I'm guessing there's more than one hand raised. And
Oh my God, it looks like a fake Facebook page.
right, it might as well. Well, is that redundant? A fake Facebook page?
Yeah, kind of redundant, sorry, but it looks like something fake on the internet on Facebook.
So it might as well be, because this is an example of a commercial website. So the truth is to the side. But I'm wondering, does anyone know what's being detoxified when someone goes through some kind of cleanse? And this is not a rhetorical question. It's not an ingenuous question. I'm actually curious to know if anyone has an answer. What toxicant is being removed from the body when someone does a detox or a cleanse? Anyone have any guess or an answer? I've been searching for years.
I think sometimes it's marketed like they'll just say to remove toxins from your body as like a blanket statement, but I've heard like lead maybe being something
Okay.
that they want removed.
So lead, maybe, sure. I don't know. Could be. Any other guesses? It's an open-ended question. I think you're right, Aileen, in saying that the term toxic is a blanket term that's just meant to satisfy whatever fear or need the consumer might have. And then the entity that's selling the product can fill that need or address that fear with their product. So here is just one of who knows how many sample images I could have pulled up. But obviously the headline here, detox water for weight loss. And I pulled a little quote and I put that at the bottom. And it's mentioning not just the fact that it's popular in some way for addressing weight loss, but the last sentence, it also tastes delicious and helps flush your body of toxins. So already we're talking about a couple different claims they're making. So there's the weight loss thing, and then there's this idea of flushing your body of toxins. It's conflating at least two concepts, I would say. So that's already a little bit suspicious. Like, what are you talking about here? Are you talking about weight loss or toxicants?
Also, like, this is cringe because of like the way it's styled, but yeah.
Sure, I can understand that. But what do you notice in that pull quote at the bottom that suggests some sort of legitimacy to this claim?
I was just thinking that I guess in society, a lot of people, we think about how we don't really eat healthy that much. So I guess some people go into like these detox as a way of a reset and then also a way of losing weight. So I guess it's like targeting, I guess, diet, but trying to show people like an easy way to get healthy, easy way that's not really legit.
Sure, I think you've mentioned a valid point that there's a market out there, absolutely. But in terms of what this particular page is messaging, what do you notice at the bottom of the pull quote that might suggest legitimacy to the claim they're making?
It has a little footnote, like there's gonna be a citation.
Exactly, it's a citation. So let's go to the citation, see what it says. So as far as I understand, this is a real journal. I mean, it's a peer-reviewed publication. And here's the article that's being cited on that webpage. The association between water consumption and body weight outcomes, a systematic review. And I'm going to jump right to the conclusions. Studies of individuals dieting for weight loss or maintenance suggest a weight-reducing effect of increased water consumption. Whereas studies in general mixed weight populations yielded inconsistent results. All right, so maybe it works for weight loss. But the second sentence, the evidence for this association is still low, mostly because of the lack of good quality studies. So what do you take away from that conclusion then? What do you feel comfortable concluding from that conclusion? Like, would you change your whole lifestyle? Would you advise patients or friends or family on anything based on this information?
No, I mean, there's no, it seems there's not really any quantitative statements there. And I guess I'd say drinking water can't hurt you really, unless it's
Right, that's
has
true.
lead in it. So you can go ahead and drink water, but that's kind of as far as I would go.
Yeah, I mean, the first sentence gives you a suggestion that maybe it works for weight loss, maybe. But the second sentence kind of pulls the rug out from under that by saying that the association is low, the studies are poor quality. So we really can't conclude anything. Now, we're not here to simply critique this particular journal article. What we're going back to is this. So the message conveyed by this one page out of how many could you find? How many instances of marketing along these lines could you find? It's innumerable. This simple one instance is trying to convince us, first of all, that there's some kind of connection between toxifying your body and weight loss, and they have some kind of solution they can sell you, and that this is real because it's based on some semblance of science, that science actually has very little to do with supporting the mixed message claim they're making. It can get very confusing if you want to break it down, but most people are not there to analyze it. Most people have a need and they want it fixed. So the easy answer is often the best answer. I'm guessing all of you have seen somewhere in your online adventures a little clickbait ad that says something along the lines of the one secret doctors don't want you to know about. Right?
Dermatologists hate her.
What's that again?
Dermatologists hate
Oh,
her.
dermatologists hate her because she found the one thing that'll solve X.
Oh, this thing can cure you of anything. Blah,
Exactly.
blah, blah, blah.
In
Clickbait.
the CS, some kind of miracle cure. The one, like, you know, something that's ancient, that's been
Or
rediscovered.
they associate it with the celebrity, like Ellen DeGeneres tried
Right.
this to date herself.
There's all these techniques for what we call rhetoric, right? How do you make your message more convincing to the audience that you're trying to appeal to? And oftentimes there's this idea there's some kind of conspiracy out there that the truth is being withheld from you, right? And that perhaps science as a endeavor is somehow working against you, right? Science is not there to help you, but it's some kind of privileged information that only the powerful have, and they're not letting you have it. And that these truth tellers are out there to bring the message to the people. As if science is hiding some other element, let's call it toxium, right? That's the root of so many problems that people are having. Forget about the pandemic, even before that. The obesity epidemic. All of the health issues that are associated with poverty and racism. Those were there. They're still there. They're worse now. There is a vulnerable, or I should say a ripe market for selling things to people who have needs. I just wanted to lay that down there as the background in terms of the work that we do in pediatric environmental health. We have to acknowledge what the media environment looks like, and sounds like, and feels like. All right, are there any Greek scholars out there? Anyone who speaks Greek, by any chance? Just curious. Correct me if I'm misusing the language. So this word toxin, toxicant, toxic, we get that from the Greek for bow, as in bow and arrow. So already we're talking about an implication of harm, a weapon, and you'll see the phrase at the bottom, toxicant pharmacon, poison for use on arrows. Pharmacon meaning the poison. So what other word do we get from pharmacon? Pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, right. Medicines. But here we're using it to mean poison. So it points out one of the big mantras we have in environmental health. And I think, Eliza, you mentioned, you know, water. Go ahead and drink water. Sure, you can drink water. But anything can be harmful in sufficient quantity. So we say the dose makes the poison. So that's not very helpful, because should we be afraid of everything? Anything can hurt us in sufficient quantity. No, we should understand that there's context for everything. This, of course, is a joke website, but it gets to that point. You can see here it says...
Wait, doesn't it look fake?
Well, this is intentionally humorous. So, you know, dihydrogen monoxide, its basis is the highly reactive hydroxyl radical, a species shown to mutate DNA, denature proteins, disrupt cell membranes, etc. That's true. That's science. Well, what's the joke here, obviously?
Well, isn't dihydrogen monoxide like water?
Yep, it's a lot like water because it's water.
water. And it's so incorrect. It's H2O.
That's right. So you can spin anything to your advantage. I'm sure none of you have seen this movie from the, I think, early 90s. But does anyone recognize that actress?
Julianne Moore?
Julianne Moore. Just a trivia question, not relevant to the content. But she was in this movie early in her career. Directed by Todd Haynes. I don't know if any of you are cinephiles. He's a art house director. He's done a lot of period pieces, critiquing gender politics. But at any rate, this is one of his early movies too, in which Julianne Moore is playing a quote unquote typical housewife who's going about her daily routine, where she might be gardening and all of a sudden she gets this rash on her hands. She's driving her kids around and she gets this severe migraine out of nowhere. She's dyeing her hair at the bottom right, and she gets a nosebleed out of the blue. And she self-diagnoses with environmental sensitivity syndrome, which is not a medical diagnosis, it's a narrative conceit for this movie. And her character moves to some farm in the middle of nowhere and wears that white hermetically sealed suit to protect her from the world she's living in. As if she needs to completely physically isolate herself in order to protect herself. It's a fear-based response to the potential dangers that are all around us. Whether it's a toxicant like arsenic in your drinking water, or water itself, if you want to believe that it can kill you, which it can. Anyone know any news reports about consuming too much water and dying from it? Is that familiar to anyone?
I think in some sense in the news it is.
And what have you heard?
There was a contest a few years ago.
Exactly.
Where you had to drink a lot of water to the point where you had to go to the bathroom.
Right.
And whoever could hold their
Right.
urine the longest would win a Wii. And then
Okay. We? That was the joke?
Yeah,
That was
hold
the
your
fun?
Wii for a Wii. And she the contestant drank so much water and couldn't expel it. She passed it.
Well, I don't know if she died from the kidney failure from not urinating or from encephalitis.
I don't know.
So if you drink enough water, your brain gets edema. It sucks up all that water and then you can die. All right, so back to the practical world. What we're trying to live in here is not a fear-based environment of very motivated messages to sell products. We're trying to get back to the science. So I'd like to introduce this concept, which is the way I like to think about environmental health. So you're familiar with the endocrine system, and again, another Greek root, krinion, which means to separate. So endocrine, you're separating within, right? So that molecule that your cell's producing leaves the cell and is put into the bloodstream, where it circulates within the body, within the body, and reaches any cell, any tissue that has blood flow. And when it's there, it causes some kind of change to the way those cells are functioning. The little messenger to cause distal change within the same body. That's the endocrine system. These are hormones. Analogously, I find it helpful to think about environmental health as perhaps the envirocrine system. So scaling up to the level of the organism instead of the cell, we, as individuals, as a human species, create molecular signals and send them out into the wider world to cause changes. And sometimes those things actually come back to us in a feedback loop, in a very literal way, to affect our own physiology. Trivia question. And we're going to play with Price is Right rules. So closest without going over. How many chemicals have humans invented in the last 100 years or so? Any guesses? Someone should probably say one, just so they can block in closest without going over. But any other guesses?
1,000?
1,000, okay. We have, let's say I'll guess one, and then we have one guess for 1,000. Any other guesses? I love that very specific guess. Is that 1,193? Love it. Definitely playing like Price is Right. You probably should have said 1,001, right? For strategic reasons. Any other guesses? 1,100. Thanks, Abra. All right, so the answer is a lot closer to 130,000. So these are things that basically did not exist in the universe until humans synthesized them. Playing in our labs, we made lots of stuff that just wasn't part of human evolution, certainly. Many of those things are what we call high production volume chemicals. Meaning we've made so much of them that they've kind of become ubiquitous in the environment. Some of them are what we call quote unquote forever chemicals, meaning they essentially don't degrade in the environment. Some of them are known to cause harm to other species and us. Has anyone heard of endocrine disruptors? Is that something anyone's heard about in the news? Where did it come up for you? Do you remember a specific instance?
Can't right
It's just a term that's kind of floating out there, but you've heard it before. Anyone else
Yeah.
familiar with endocrine disrupting chemicals? So things
Yeah,
like
like cleaning products and stuff. I've seen like
Sometimes.
Instagram posts about it.
okay. They show up in lots of different consumer products. Two of the big categories are phthalates and bisphenols. So for those of you who have a plastic water bottle in the vicinity, if you would purchase it yourself, you might have noticed a label on it that said BPA free. And you're like, oh, okay. I wasn't looking for BPA, but I guess I'm glad that there's no BPA in this. What's BPA? So BPA is bisphenol A. It's an endocrine disrupting chemical. It's something that we don't have in water bottles these days because of a lot of advocacy to make sure we don't use that in the manufacturing process.
It says BPA free in every water bottle today. I recognize that.
Exactly, right. So what the heck's BPA though? Well, it's an endocrine disrupting chemicals in the category of bisphenols. Bisphenols are associated with disease. For example, breast cancer. So you might ask, well, why was it in the water bottles to begin with? Well, from a materials perspective, there was a reasonable reason. Does anyone know what the word plastic means literally? Why do we use the word plastic to mean plastics? If you're using it as an adjective, it's very plastic. What does that mean? Malleable. You can change the form, change the shape. Plastic means something that can be used in a lot of different ways based on its material properties. And inherently, it's just kind of a floppy, gooey mess. But that's not a great property for a water bottle. We need some rigidity. So we add a plasticizer in the category of bisphenols to make it rigid. So it can be a water bottle the way we want it to be. On the other hand, let's say you're making plastic tubing for the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. And you have to be able to insert these tubes into tiny little babies to feed them or give them IV lines and such. In that case, you don't want rigidity, you want flexibility. In that case, you'd add a phthalate, which makes things more bendy. So there are good reasons to put these things in from a materials perspective. The problem is that from the health perspective, we're always playing catch up, trying to understand, hey, wait a minute, that thing that you're putting in the tubes, that thing you're putting in the water bottles, it turns out that's harmful, especially on a population level. You can't say with one individual, oh, you had too many phthalates, therefore you have disease X. But on a population level, you can assume that a certain percentage of the cases of breast cancer, for example, can be attributed to exposure to all those endocrine disrupting chemicals in our products. So it's very difficult to catch up with all the 130,000 plus chemicals we have, which means that we have to change the way we do things at the policy level. So where does that fall on the Freedom Triangle? Changing context, right? So if I was to go out there and say, excuse me, did you know that BPA in water bottles is associated with breast cancer? I think you should buy an aluminum water bottle instead, or a BPA-free plastic bottle. How long would it take for me to spread that message from person to person to person to person, right? Even if I want it to transform from the education tier down to a social norm where I can change the context, just imagine the efforts. Imagine the expense. Imagine the amount of time. Imagine all of the collaborators I would need to create that ubiquitous message. And that would just be for BPA. Forget about BPS, BPX. Forget about all the other endocrine, forget about all the hundreds of thousands of other chemicals, or over 100,000 chemicals that I might be worried about. I'll never catch up. It's like the myth of Sisyphus. All that work and the ball keeps rolling back down my way. So policies, for example, in Europe, they have a reverse system. Instead of having the scientific community and community advocates raising the alarm about this chemical in this product that's already out there in the marketplace, instead, they have to demonstrate safety before a product can be released to the public. That's changing the context. It would be wonderful if we can get there in this country. All right, so you're going to learn more about the particulars in terms of routes of exposure. And I'm just checking the messages here. We'll go, oh, yep, thank you. Okay. About routes of exposure and unique vulnerabilities of children, because I think most of you, if not all of you, will be taking Dr. Lauren Zajak's course on environmental health later on. So we'll skip some of those basics because you'll get them in more detail in her class. But, right. So with all that information I just shared about anything can hurt you in sufficient quantity, there are over 100,000 chemicals that we've manufactured, and the harms of any one of them, much less combinations of them, are only just being elucidated. How much of the heart disease in the world is caused by our own chemicals? How much of the cancer? How much of the obesity? How much of the diabetes? How much of the infant mortality? How much of the decreasing lifespan in this country? These are all big questions that we can't sufficiently answer yet. So it's really easy to think, oh my gosh, if I have a child, if I'm going to have a child, I need to protect that child. I need to be like Julianne Moore in that movie Safe. We have to protect the child from the world that the child lives in. I have just some examples of things. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we have some natural toxicants. So
The
what,
left is pollutants in the air.
right? So what does the sun do in terms of a toxicant? Why is the sun potentially harmful to you?
UV radiation.
UV radiation, so forms of energy can be toxicants. How about that tree? There's two things happening with that tree.
The pollen and smoke.
Pollen, and it seems to be on fire, right? So pollen we're all familiar with. If we have seasonal allergies, that's not fun. And you might think, a few years ago, we might have thought, oh, a tree on fire, yeah, Smokey the Bear, yeah, don't start forest fires, yeah, I get it. But if you were around in New York City this summer, or somewhere else on the East Coast, there weren't any forest fires here. But the air quality index got as high as 170 in a scale where over 150 indicates you probably shouldn't go outside and breathe the air. Where is that coming from? The West Coast in Oregon. That smoke is traveling clearly all the way across the continent to our part of the world and causing breathing problems for so many people. Volcanoes, similarly, you wouldn't think, oh, well, I don't live in Hawaii, so who cares? Air quality. This is not something we can control. Like volcanoes will happen regardless of human activity. But it's easy to think of the world out there as out to get you. And then what's under the ground? What's that RN?
Radiation? Radon?
Radon, exactly, which does emit radiation, another form of energy, which can be harmful. It's the number 2 risk factor for lung cancer after tobacco smoke. It's endemic in some geologies where people live. It's easily remedied, though. If you happen to live in a radon endemic area or a house is built on rocks that have radon in them, it's heavier than air, the particles, so they'll be hanging out in your basement. You put a little fan in the basement, has a little chimney going the outside of the house, above the roof line, and just sucks the air constantly out of there and releases it where it disperses to harmless levels. And then forget about, the nature stuff, this miasma of toxicants that humans have created, anthropogenic sources. It's easy to think about the entire world being dangerous. That's not the message we try to endorse in pediatric environmental health.
You can't let kids fear the world.
It doesn't tend to help. It tends to make things worse because you're exacerbating the socially mediated negative consequences of that isolation. Rather, we try to endorse what you might think of as normal stuff. Reading with children. A nurturing home environment, meaning that there's interactivity between parents and children and siblings and neighbors and friends. All forms of play, whether it's indoor, outdoor, structured, unstructured. Different forms of exercise, physically exploring the environment, indoor and out. A varied diet, sleep hygiene, so that's all about having a regular bedtime. No TVs, no screen time. At night especially. These sort of obvious things that are part of a quote-unquote healthy childhood are physiologically protective against toxicants in almost any shape or form. So let's get into that a little bit more. We're going to switch slide decks now. As we talk about lead in particular. All right, here's our old friend lead. I mentioned lead because lead is perhaps the most well understood, well characterized toxicant we know of. We have hundreds of years of understanding on the health consequences of lead exposure. Trivia time again. Anyone know why Pb is the elemental symbol for lead? I think we're switching from Greek to Latin in this case. I'll give you a hint. There's a profession historically associated with lead that has the same root word. Plumbing, plumbers. So plumbum is where we get PB from. Why do you think plumbers, let's go back to Roman era as an example. You know, they were famous for their aqueducts and plumbing. Why do you think they chose to use lead instead of, let's say, iron for their plumbing? So I see readily available. Now, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that iron is a lot more plentiful in the Earth's crust. And that if you have a quantity of ore, it's gonna have a lot more iron in it than lead. So let's say that iron is actually more available. Why do you think they might choose the lead instead of the iron?
Does it not like erode as quickly or something? I don't know anything about chemistry, so
Yeah,
I'm
well, I mean, I think like corrode, right? It doesn't rust.
erode. There you go.
So yeah, if you have water running through your pipes, you don't want them to rust. That would certainly happen with iron pipes. But lead is an amazing material. Like I was talking about with plastics, like from a materials perspective, you can do amazing stuff with plastics. With lead, oh my gosh. It is malleable. So the word malleable, mal comes from the word for hammer. So you can literally bang it into shape. It's like metallic Play-Doh, right? Imagine you're a plumber back in Roman times, and you're trying to like put together the emperor's toiletries, and like you have one pipe coming in this way, and you're like, here's the other pipe coming in this way, and you're like, oh shoot, they don't fit. No problem. If it's lead, bang, 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 bang. Your head is saved, right? So it's an amazing material from that perspective. It also adds vibrancy to pigments. So it has a lot of cool properties. But we don't like it in people. Now, the old model was that if there was enough lead, the dose makes the poison, right? So if there was enough lead exposure in a child, then the child might experience seizures, coma, or even death. But if you weren't at that stage, then don't worry about it, the kid's fine. Another trivia question. Does anyone know, I'm not really a trivia question, more of a question for anyone in the audience who happens to know your blood lead level when it was tested when you were a kid. Does anyone happen to know their blood lead level? I don't know mine because we didn't test when I was a kid. But I believe all of you are of the age where they may have tested you, depending on where you were living at the time. Does anyone know what a quote unquote normal blood lead level is? I wouldn't expect you to know if you're not working in the field, just a trivia question, but we measured in micrograms per deciliter. And I see one guess of up to 10. Thank you, Neil. And that used to be the case in this country maybe 10, 15 years ago. Our level of concern was anything above 10. But since then, it's been reduced to 5. And then most recently, it's about to drop to 3.5, I believe. So the lead level of concern keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And this, the first lead screening program in the United States actually was in Chicago in 1960. And based on this dichotomous model, their level of concern was 60 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the blood. Now, if you had a 60 today, let's say you had a child coming into the doctor for some kind of routine visit, and you got a 60 on the blood lead, the alarms would go off left and right. That's way above the level in which we might chelate. And chelation is a word meaning claw. And it's giving a medicine that actually sort of latches on to the lead molecules and allows your body to pee them out. Because that level of lead gets you in the seizure, coma, death territory. But back then, it was like, well, if the kid's not seizing, then no problem. Since then, we've come to understand lead a lot better, such that any measurable level of lead is associated with adverse health effects at the population level. The population level is important because we can't say for sure any one child with a certain lead level has been affected in an adverse way. But just like I was saying with plastics, with endocrine disruptors, if we subject an entire population to a certain amount of lead, we can expect a certain increase in these adverse effects all around neurocognitive development. The dose makes the poison. Interestingly, with lead, there's a bit of a surprise. So we know that lead can interfere with brain development. It's not surprising to think that there's an associated loss of IQ points. The surprising thing is that the first 10 micrograms of lead per deciliter are associated with 4 points, a 4-point drop in IQ, whereas the second, so from 10 to 20, only another 2, and then after 20, from 20 to 30, only another point. So you get the biggest hit up front. The dose makes the poison, but the smallest dose up front is the most poisonous in this case, which makes it all the more imperative, if we're talking about baby brains, that we have to be vigilant and get rid of that lead exposure for the entire population, because we do the most damage at the smallest doses. Does anyone know, before I talk about this slide right here, does anyone know how we got rid of lead in the environment? By any chance? Does anyone know where the lead was coming from? Say it louder.
Paint? Oh.
Paint? So paint. Yep, paint is one of the sources. What's the other big one?
Gasoline.
Gasoline.
Yes. There used to be a thing called leaded gasoline. You go to the pump and you could choose, depending on how your engine was made, you might need leaded gasoline for your engine. Anyone know why we put lead in gasoline? It wasn't there naturally. So I talked about plasticizers, right? It makes sense. If you want a water bottle to be rigid, you need something to make it rigid. Turns out BPA is not really good for you. So these other things now, which, to be honest, we don't know how dangerous those other things are. But gasoline, why would we put lead in the gasoline? I won't leave you hanging in suspense. But it's something we call an anti-knock agent. Anti-knock, K-N-O-C-K. So if you put just the gasoline in your engine, and you inject the air and you have the spark plug, you make a little explosion inside the cylinder, which drives the piston. And that's how you make your wheels turn. But that explosion is very disorganized. It's like popcorn going off, which can be, damaging to the engine over the long term, but it also is really inefficient. You're not getting the most energy out of your combustion. So an anti-knock agent makes the explosion smooth and more complete. So some of you are probably familiar with the hospital called Sloan Kettering. Kettering was the guy that put the lead in the gasoline. He's not a hero. We already knew some of the dangers of lead.
It's pretty ironic, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
They named him Sloan Kettering Hospital.
Exactly. So his team of scientists were checking out a whole list of possible candidates for the anti-knock that they could add to gasoline. And lead was among them. They chose lead out of other successful candidates, partly because Kettering had financial interests in the lead mining industry, as far as I understand. And so he was sort of making money on both ends by smelting the lead and then processing it in gasoline and selling the gasoline manufacturing process to the gas companies. So not a great public health story, because that resulted in, it's hard to estimate the economic toll of all that lead exposure in the brains of babies around the world over decades and decades, but it's well into the trillions of dollars of damage. And that's a nice segue to this slide, shifting the curve. So as I mentioned, I have no idea what my blood lead level was when I was a child because we didn't test. But from historical data, research data, we can guess that mine was probably around a 15. So if we go back to that IQ slide, I certainly had the first 10 micrograms per deciliter and maybe another 5. So let's say I lost 5 IQ points. Let's say my entire generation was 5 IQ points short of what we should have had. So if 100 by definition is average intelligence, and we shift people from 100 down to 95, what do you think is the personal experience of that otherwise 100 IQ person who now is a 95? What changes in their life? Anything?
Probably not a ton at that level.
Yeah, you're still square in the normal range. You would never know the difference. That's not where the problem is when we talk about shifting the curve. We're talking about the tails. So this data is actually old. We're closer to, I think, 330 million people in this country. But for the sake of argument, we're talking about the 7 million who were gifted and the 7 million with intellectual disability. If you expose the whole population to all that lead, then the entire curve shifts by 5 points. So now you have only 3 million people at the gifted end, and concomitantly you've increased the number of people with intellectual disability to 11 million. So you've lost the productivity on that side, and you've increased the cost of all the services needed on this side. So it's a lot like driving with your parking brake on in terms of the economic strength of your country. Not to mention the actual harm caused to people, especially children. It's really astounding how well we did. So we mentioned the pain in the gasoline. The gasoline especially This is just a 4-year period from the first, beginning of the ban in this country. And you can see how the triangles, the lead, and the squares, the blood lead, travel very closely together. You drop the lead in gasoline, you suddenly drop the amount of lead in people's bodies. And that's, going up to just 1980. It's continued. So the average lead, the median amount of lead is less than 1 now. That's incredible. We've saved, like I was saying, billions of dollars up to trillions of dollars by removing all that lead from the environment. Now let's compare 2 strategies here. As a pediatrician, if I'm talking to a parent who has kids and they're worried about lead, they might say, well, what can I do to protect my kid from the lead? Well, I say, do you live in a house that has old lead paint in it? And they say, yes. And I say, okay, well, it'd be great if you could remediate the house. We do what we call an abatement to properly fix the lead in that house. But short of that, you could every day make sure to wet mop the floor to get all that lead paint dust away from your child. You can wipe down the windowsills with the paint on them to get rid of that dust. You could do that every day. Where does that fall on the freedom triangle? I'm telling the parent, every day I would like you to mop the floor and wipe down the windowsills.
Clinical?
So, okay, I heard education here, and what I hear on the screen?
Clinical?
Clinical, right. So just you're both right. Telling the person is educational, but if they actually do it, that's clinical, right? So how far can I get in terms of saving the world if I'm expecting every person to mop their floors and wipe down their windowsills every day if our goal is to save the brains of millions of babies? How far can we get? Not very. But what was successful? We banned lead from gasoline and then paint. And look what happened. Right? We changed the context. So I think we'll end it there. We're a little bit early, but that's fine. So any comments or questions on any of the stuff we've talked about here in terms of environmental health, toxicants, policies versus individual burdens?
I have a question, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but what was the specific policy that changed? Who decided, no more lead in gasoline? Was that was there a single
There's a
politician?
funny story to that. So it's connected to Mount Sinai here, actually. Our previous chair of our department, named Phil Landrigan, he was involved in one of the foundational studies when he worked for the CDC. He did an investigation of lead toxicity. It was discovered that a lot of children, I think it was in Texas near the Mexican border, a lot of children had really high levels of lead, even for the time. And it was pretty clear once they started investigating that there was a concentration of lead exposure right around a lead smelter, of all things. And as you got further away from the lead smelter, the blood lead levels were decreasing. So it was a pretty stark example that lead was bad. And those kids, had associated decrements in cognitive performance. But that was just one piece of the puzzle that was being assembled over decades until we finally got to the point where action had to be taken. Now, the sad and funny thing about it is that the removal of lead from gasoline ultimately was not about the health of children. The reason they did it in the end is because there was another law about making sure the exhaust from the tailpipe was not so dirty. I mean, that's also a good thing. We don't want so much air pollution, the Clean Air Act, right? The leaded gasoline was damaging to what we call the catalytic converters, which would help reduce the pollution from that exhaust. So the lead was interfering with, I think, the platinum in the catalytic converters. So they had to get rid of the lead for that reason, and not directly because of the harm it was causing to babies' brains. So at any rate, it happened. We got rid of it. Actually, in New York City, we got rid of it early in 1960. It was banned in the city. But it wasn't until the mid-70s that it was banned in the United States.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. And then as another side note, for those of you who remember the 1990s, and a character named Rudy Giuliani, he was mayor of the city at the time, and he was taking credit for the pronounced drop in crime in New York City, especially compared to the 80s and such, when we had really high crime rates. He was championing his decisions and the police's work. But the truth is that crime was dropping across the whole country. It wasn't unique to New York City. It wasn't something special that New York City was doing. And there's a very interesting hypothesis that the drop in crime in the 1990s is largely thanks to removing lead from gasoline and paint. What's the deal there? Well, we know that lead exposure in babies' brains interferes with frontal lobe development. So learning, memory, cognition, socializing, all those things that make us humans happen in the frontal lobe. And that's where lead does the worst damage. So if you have a cohort of babies all exposed to lead, and you let them grow up, at the age of 21, that's the age at which violent crimes are most likely to be committed. If you stagger 1976 by 21 years, you get 1997, which is when the crime started dropping precipitously. There's a really nice correlation, just like we had with lead removal from gasoline and blood lead levels in people. You can map the same thing with, when did we remove the lead from gasoline? Stagger by 21 years. What did the crime rate do? Now, correlation is not causation, so that by itself is not a closing argument. But we do have a mechanism, right? We know that we're no longer interfering with frontal lobe development, and lead was removed in different states at different times and in different countries at different times. And if you map out the same 21-year difference, you get the same drop in violent crime rates. So it's a very enticing hypothesis that removing lead from gasoline not only was helping individual brains, but helping society. So you don't think about, oh, I'm worried about crime in my city. We should get rid of the lead. You don't think that way. People don't think that way. Politicians don't think that way. But that was probably one of the best things we could do, to get rid of the lead, to fight crime. So that gives you some sense of the power of environmental health. It gives you perspective. You can look at a problem up close and at the macro level to understand the systems involved and understand, especially when you bring in the Freedom Triangle, where do I have leverage to change things? Where do I have the opportunity to reflect the values that we espouse as a society? Forget the rhetoric, forget that messaging about fear, forget selling products to make money. What value do we espouse in public health? If you can identify the values, then you can attach environmental health principles to getting things done to achieve those values. How's that for a wrap up? Any other last questions?
That was very inspirational.
Thank you. Go get them. Go team. The last assignment is a written assignment. And again, we're focusing on the triangle. We're really going to drill this home so you feel like you're a master of this model. The idea is you're going to find a journal. So let me rephrase that. When I say journal, I mean like a newspaper, a magazine, something in the popular media, a news source. It could be a video, it's fine. But a news article reporting on some public health issue that mentions some kind of intervention to fix the problem. And you're going to identify where that intervention falls on the Frieden triangle. There might be 2 interventions mentioned. You can map both of them to the triangle. But whatever's left, you're going to then fill in the gaps on the triangle. Say, well, they mentioned something at this level. If you wanted to fill in the other levels, here are my suggestions. Okay? So it's kind of a ramping up. So first you have the prep questions, just to get you in the mood of answering these Frieden levels. Then we have the quiz to demonstrate your understanding of that. And now you're going to sort of demonstrate your mastery by critically analyzing a news report so that you can go forth and pass this knowledge on to your colleagues and in your future work so we can change the world in the most effective way and efficient way possible. All right, thanks for your attention, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Professor. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.